Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole, and today I wanted to go back to talking about some of my favorite pianists from the past. I have this whole series of videos which I've been doing on various pianists that I love, and today we are looking at the wonderful Myra Hess. And Myra Hess is a pianist that you don't hear people talk about enough, I think, nowadays, young pianists and so forth. I heard plenty of people talking about Schnabel and Cortot and so forth, but hardly anyone ever talked about Myra Hess when I was in college, for example. And she's really such a special artist, perhaps not sufficiently represented in her recording output, but what there is of her is really amazing, and I want to go into a little bit of depth on a few of her recordings. She had kind of an unusual mixture of qualities in her playing because there was definitely this kind of intellectual rigor behind everything that she did, but she also played with this incredible kind of power and energy, sometimes it could be almost animalistic. And at the same time, she could also be very suave and lyrical. For me, it's really a perfect combination of disparate elements that comes together into this incredible musicianship and this incredible personality. So if any of you happen to have watched the old Art of Piano documentary, which is something I grew up with when I was a teen, you may have seen some little clips of her playing. There's a famous video performance of her doing the Beethoven Appassionata sonata. I won't play you the whole thing because it is available on YouTube. I'm going to link to the complete performance. But let's start with a little short clip of her so we can get acquainted with some of that incredible energy and power that she had. So it is very impressive, right? Kind of earth-shattering and cataclysmically powerful. I might not entirely agree with the very rapid tempo, but she does really make it work in a very powerful way. But again, as I mentioned, she had this supremely lyrical and poetic side to her as well. And since we're just getting acquainted here for the first time, I want to play you a little snippet from a performance which really typifies that for me. And it's probably my favorite performance ever of the slow movement of Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto. If you're not familiar with the piece, it's oftentimes suggested that the slow movement might be supposed to illustrate the myth of Orpheus and the underworld, singing to the Furies to release his dead wife, Eurydice. Orpheus, of course, was beloved of Apollo and was one of the great musicians of legend. And you can hear that Beethoven maybe is suggesting the sounds of the harp that Orpheus would have been playing as he sings this incredibly plaintive melody which ends up moving the spirits of the underworld to sympathy. So this is a live performance of Myra Hess with Adrian Bolt and the BBC. just so incredibly wonderful and so poetic and rapt. You might also notice that she very consciously avoids over-emoting. At the start of this passage where she has the arpeggios going up and this melody that kind of falls down from on high, I think most pianists would apply quite a lot of rubato to this phrase and would really try to emote a good deal, but she plays it in a little bit more of an austere way. She still has this incredible beauty of tone. She brings out the pedal effects that Beethoven notates here remarkably well, but there's something almost a little bit distant and yes, austere. And this is something that I'm going to come back to later when we talk about a little bit more of her Beethoven playing, which for me is pretty much the ideal. But she also had another side to her, which I think really does come out very much when you hear her speak. There's a couple very nice interviews with her that you can find on YouTube, and I've also linked them in the description box. She had a very charming side to her, and a very suave, elegant kind of side to her playing. So another little clip from the Art of Piano documentary, which you've probably, if you saw that video, then you probably also know this one. A little excerpt from the Mozart G Major Concerto, and this was from her series of concerts that she gave during the darkest days of the Second World War, when bombs were dropping on London. She did this series of lunchtime concerts because it was so difficult for people to have evening performances, and oftentimes they actually had raids and bombing raids occurring during the concerts, but they always kept going. So this little excerpt is from that. It's Mozart G Major Concerto, so let's hear a little bit of that. Really wonderful. I think in one of those interviews, which I've linked in the description box, Hess does talk about how important spontaneity really is in Mozart playing. The most important quality, I think, that she highlights. And I think even from that little clip, you can tell how spontaneous and kind of charming her playing could be. Also, I was very happy to see when I saw this clip that she had a page turner as well. So she was not necessarily a stickler for always being memorized all the time. Something which she also talks about in reference to her wonderful teacher, Tobias Mathé. So really a very interesting individual, a very heroic individual in some ways, the way that she made this artistic project work during the war. So I want to go on and talk about a little bit more detail of some of her recordings. There's been many that I've found to be absolutely wonderful and that have been very strongly influential on me. I'll only have time to mention one or two in the sort of detail that I usually like going into. So the first one I'm going to talk about is her recording of Carnaval, Opus 9 of Schumann. And this is one of the great performances of this piece, in my opinion. I think it's even on par with the superb recording by Sergei Rachmaninoff, which is kind of legendary. In some ways, I even like it more. That's kind of a daring thing to say, but I'm going to back it up. So what are the qualities of her playing in this piece? Well, she plays with a huge sound, this wonderful kind of romantic freedom and sensibility, exactly the right kind of freedom that Schumann really requires, this feeling that you are improvising the music in the moment. Now, as far as tempi go, she's a little more restrained than Rachmaninoff, which I kind of like. Rachmaninoff's tempi in this piece could be kind of wild and very, very thrilling. Hess is still very, very exciting, but it's a little bit more filled out, a little bit more patient. She gets some of the colors out of the movements, which maybe Rachmaninoff misses a little bit with his blazing speed. So let's hear a few examples of that. And maybe I'll even put back-to-back here Rachmaninoff's version of the first piece that I'm going to show you, although this is not primarily meant to be a comparison, but just to kind of give you an idea of how they differ in some ways. So here is the fantastic performance by Sergei Rachmaninoff first. So there's several things that I really, really like about both of their performances, but maybe if I had to choose, if a gun was pointed to my head, I might choose Hess's, partly because of how beautifully she brings out the double line in the right hand. So the right hand thumb is playing these little bouncy repeated notes, but then the fifth finger has to have this very melodic, suave line. And it's all supposed to be pianissimo as well, so kind of intimate and hushed. And I like how she lets the middle section build. It's a little more plaintive. She goes a little deeper and is a little bit more patient with the timing. So that's something that I think is really special. I'd also just point out that there's kind of a wonderful humor about the way she ends the piece too, just kind of stopping suddenly. Whereas Rachmaninoff kind of rounds it out a little bit more in a slightly more romantic way. So they're different styles, of course, and I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other, because as you probably already know if you've watched this channel, I revere Rachmaninoff's piano playing to high heaven, one of my favorite pianists of all time. It's interesting to just see what Hess brings out of this piece and how artistic she really is with her choices. I wanted to highlight another example of her very great taste in this piece, which is from the Valse Allemande movement. And in this movement, she very delicately makes sure that we hear this little written out ornament with the 16th note on the beat. I think Schumann wrote it like this on purpose to give this Valse Allemande a very old-fashioned kind of sound. You know, there was a certain period where German music always had small notes and ornaments played on the beats. That was kind of a dominant style of playing, as was given out by C.P.E. Bach and other theorists of the time. And over time, that kind of changed a bit until it was no longer such a common thing to always play things like that on the beat. So here, Schumann's trying to show that to us, and Myra Hess also seems to get the whole style of it herself. So very, very charming. I just love the way that she does that. And Hess was not only amazing in these kinds of delicate little details, she also, as you already know, she brings a lot of power and strength to her playing. So I also wanted to highlight the beginning of the final movement, the Marche de Davidsbündler, contre les Philistins. Her playing here is just so descriptive and kind of imaginative. She really makes the programmatic element stand out. So just listen here how she makes the left hand sound like bombs and cannon fire. She takes some of the notes down an octave in order to facilitate this. Just love that. I could listen to her playing Carnaval all day. You can tell she's making the piano really shake with her sound here. It's a very commanding sound. The thing I love about Hess's sound in the loud sections is that she's never harsh, though. It's always very warm and rounded. And also, her fast tempi never sound hurried. Always she sounds like it's very natural and it fits into the musical idea. So I wanted to go back to Beethoven now. And it's kind of unfortunate I'm focusing on these German composers, Schumann and Beethoven, because Hess did play a lot of other things very, very well. There's a famous recording of her playing Granados, for example, the Maha and the Nightingale from Goyescas, and she did many other things very, very well, some modern music. There's a fantastic recording of her playing a little-known sonata by what was a contemporary composer for her, Howard Ferguson, as well as pieces by Debussy, Ravel, Manuel de Falla. She really had a highly varied style, and she could handle a lot of different ways of writing for the piano. However, for me, she is really the ideal Beethoven player, so I do want to talk a little bit about that. I do really wish we had more of her Beethoven. There are some live performances of the Fourth Concerto, we already heard a little bit of that, and the Fifth Concerto, as well as a handful of sonatas that she recorded. The one that I treasure the most of her Beethoven recordings is her recording of the 30th Piano Sonata in E major, Opus 109. So again, kind of what I touched on when we were talking about her Beethoven 4 slow movement, it's a very reflective interpretation. It's free of anything that's overtly dramatic or harsh, as well as the overtly sentimental. So this Beethoven 109 seems to me more like a kind of natural edifice, like if you look at nature, trees, mountains, things that are very different from us, but at the same time we can kind of sense this striking kinship and that we're drawn to these natural phenomena. And time again, I'm just amazed at the way that she synthesizes fidelity to the score with freedom and imagination. So for example, in 109, there's this whole idea of the crescendo with subito piano afterwards. And she delivers this idea in such a perfect, transparent way. There's no exaggeration. It's so natural and unforced. It can oftentimes sound like a bit of a trick device or a little bit like someone's trying to scare you with this idea, but not for her. And there's no showing off a finger technique, no kind of crass drama to her playing. It's just the inner feeling is really made visible, and there's a kind of a spiritual presence to her playing. So let's hear a little bit of the first movement of Opus 109. So I fully realize for some people who are not used to her approach, you might find this to be a little bit too rigid rhythmically or too stiff. I don't find it to be stiff though myself. I think it's just so direct and everything is stated so clearly. The musical ideas are made so clear without there being any kind of sense of academia about it, of a didactic or pedantic quality. So I highly recommend listening to the whole recording of this sonata. I've also linked it in the description box because it is very powerful, the kind of mood that she builds throughout the entire piece. There's a kind of deep sense of peace, of centeredness that she creates, and it's cumulative over the entire piece. So I'm skipping around a little bit. I'm going to go to the last movement, which is my favorite part, and she takes a daringly slow tempo in this movement. So if you're more used to recent interpretations by someone like Andras Schiff, you're going to be surprised at how slow it is, but she really does make this sense of space and peace. And there's no sensationalizing, there's no over-emoting. There's a very touching simplicity that's very hard to imitate. So let's actually start. The last movement is a theme and variations, and let's skip the theme for now and go to the first variation, because the theme comes again at the end of the movement, and we'll hear it then. So let's hear a little bit of this first variation. So as we listen to her play this repeat, notice in particular how exquisitely she interprets the turn in the third bar here. A lot of people will already introduce a crescendo at this moment. She really reads the score precisely, and she sees that there is no crescendo yet. And she does that without drawing attention to it, though. She plays it in just the natural way it should be, almost as if it's being whispered. The singer is kind of whispering to themselves at that point. So for me, this is the true meaning of fidelity to the text, that you not only bring all the markings in the music to life, but you bring the inner meaning behind those markings to vivid life in the sound itself. Sometimes I think that we might feel that we're doing that when we try to be really precise about making sure that every crescendo and every little marking is there in the score, but if it doesn't really come through into a deeper kind of musical meaning that really transcends that, then it's not really what it's all about. We have to somehow translate these markings into a real living, breathing creation in the moment. So I want to go into the second variation, which is a little bit more humorous in character to a certain degree. And there's a little bit of an issue here because, as you'll see, this second variation, Beethoven has marked leggermente, and oftentimes people interpret this as staccato, which I don't necessarily agree with. In fact, I'm usually annoyed by those sort of interpretations. I think people usually make it sound like I'm being poked by something, by a stick or something like that. It sounds very disjointed and kind of out of place. Now, Hess actually does interpret it this way, as staccato, but when she does it, I actually don't mind. Even though I'm not 100% convinced, she makes it very beautiful, more like a starry sky or something like that. Yes, I'm more and more convinced every time I hear her do it, actually. She plays it in such a elegant and graceful way. I think it's partly because the staccati are not super short, and also that her tempo is a little slower, more reflective, so it doesn't give it this kind of hyperactive sound, which is what I mainly object to when other people play it staccato like that. Now I'm going to jump ahead to a section from the fourth variation. She plays this a little slower than many people. Again, the patience is really extraordinary, and this is some of the most beautiful pianissimo, super soft playing that I've ever heard. So words can't really do it justice. Let's just hear the way she plays this section from the fourth variation. Really wonderful. Just this kind of warmth and the sense of stillness that she creates. It's quite unique to my mind. Now we'll go on, we'll get a little bit more of loud playing to counteract all this super soft playing. So there's a kind of puration at the end in the final variation, this big build-up. The pianist plays all these scales on the left hand, and there are these kind of bell notes that ring out in the upper register. And here, once again, she plays a little slower than most people. She doesn't rush at all. She makes this incredibly luminous sound. So the trill and the scales in the left hand don't sound aggressive and brilliant. They sound kind of warm and floating almost, even though it's loud. And then in the upper register with the bell, it's so clear and just penetrating and beautiful. She went for something that was very unusual. Instead of going for a big ending effect, she tries to create something which is more spiritual. There's no other word for it, I guess. Something that almost seems to transcend the instrument and the player. So there we heard the theme repeated at the end. Beethoven was undoubtedly influenced a little bit by Johann Sebastian Bach's Goldberg variations here in writing a theme and variations with a sarabande-like theme, which repeats at the end. So there's a lot of very interesting qualities about her playing. Oftentimes there's a kind of Germanness, for want of a better word. I'm speaking about linguistic qualities here, about the way that she's very clear in her articulation. So in places where many pianists might be tempted to play in a smoother, less articulate way and kind of make long lines, she brings out smaller groupings of notes, and in this very true way, I think, for the way that it's notated, with sometimes smaller slurs and this feeling of consonant and of smaller words. So she always makes those consonants very clear, which of course is a striking aspect of the German language as well, and it only makes sense that it comes out a little bit in the music. It's obvious that she knows every expression mark in the music intimately, but there's nothing sterile about that she's being faithful to these markings or academic about it. She brings everything to full life. So I could go on for days. I already mentioned some of her other great performances. The Brahms B-flat Concerto with Bruno Walter is an absolutely heroic one. You might just have to go and listen to everything of hers on YouTube, and when you've exhausted all of that, go and check out some of these box sets of her playing, because it really is well worth it. I know that I've been really enriched by being able to come into contact with her artistry at secondhand like this. I can only imagine what it would have been like to hear her in person. So I hope you enjoyed that little talk about Myra Hess. Please stay tuned. Next week I'll bring you some more music or something next week. I'm still working on my recording of the Liszt Sonata. I got a first take though, so I'm pretty close to being able to bring you that video, which is, I know, awaited with bated breath. But anyway, for now I'm going to sign off and just wish you a very nice weekend and a great week after it. So take care, keep practicing, see you next week.